see, up until you see beyond it, everything is dominated by oneself, is it not? I want to be awakened, I want to be enlightened, I want to have some spiritual revelation, which is really no different than I want an ice cream cone. I want to be loved. I want to be agreed with. I want to be disagreed with. I like or I don't like. Do you see how the fiction of self always keeps itself in the center of one's consciousness? Yeah? And spiritual awakening is seen through the fiction of that actually there isn't actually a self in the center of one's consciousness. That's what this term that I use, that a lot of people don't like, or it frightens them, emptiness means. Right? Empty of self. Full of reality, absolutely full of the divine, but empty of self. Of course, self wants it both ways. Huh? It wants to have the divine, but make sure I'm here to experience it. And if you experience it, then it wants to make sure it's there to try to maintain that experience. But anybody in this room who had even a glimpse of an awakening to real reality, one of the hallmarks is the absence of self. That's the beauty of it. And most of human beings, most of us are so deeply in a trance state that it's even hard to consider what you would be, that you could be something other than a self. Think of yourself as something other than a self. If you really want to confuse yourself, just try. What could I be other than a self? Whether it's an enlightened self, or a little ordinary human self, or a super self, or a good self, or a bad self, or, you see what I mean? A self that's in heaven or hell, or enlightened or unenlightened. All of that is just more self-seeking, you see? And it's really, we're so encultured into this that it's almost impossible for most people's minds to actually think of themselves, what they could be, the reality of them in any other terms other than a self. That's how complete the fiction has become. Yeah. So I come here, I just come to help each person, anybody who wants, anybody who doesn't want, that's fine, but anybody who wants, to actually look into the nature of their experience here and now. And the first thing you might see, you might begin to see, even though your mind doesn't understand it, even though it's baffling, you might see there isn't actually self-nature in any of this experience. You might see it. You might see it like you see a teacup or an orange or a microphone. You're like, I see it. There's really not. Confusion is confusion. Clarity is clarity. Happiness is happiness. Sadness is sadness. Consciousness is consciousness. And there isn't a self to which all that's pertaining. You might see it. It's also possible you might go beyond just seeing it, because to see it isn't quite the same as to realize it, is it? It's in the same way that to see an orange is not the same thing as eating an orange, right? So you can have it pointed out to you, yes, there's an orange. You go, oh, I've never seen one, lovely. But to see it, to see the absence of self is one thing, to experience it is quite something else. But to see it opens the doorway to the experience. It opens a doorway. It is ironic, is it not, that the thing that terrifies oneself the most which is the absence of self, is a very terrifying notion to a lot of people, is actually the exact same thing which gives rise to liberation. The liberation from self.